So welcome everybody to our third webinar from Dublin, Ireland. We're delighted you can join us today. I'm Mary Cronin from Upthink Innovation Agency. My co-host, Ciara Slevin from Climate Matters, and Joanne O'Rourke from Dublin City Council, Eastern Midlands Waste Region. Over the last webinar, we've discussed what is the circular economy and the future of food and bio-based systems. Today's focus is on funding and finance, and we get a lot of questions on how do we get funding. And we share with you the funding landscape and some of the mechanisms available. And that is easier said than done, as there are many different types of funding for different sectors. And companies are at different stages, hence different requirements. So we can't cover everything today in 1 hour, but we are signposting. So we've 4 great presenters who'll talk through their journeys with domain expertise and will share their insights that will help you build knowledge links and help to unlock the opportunities. We'll start with Filippo from the Irish Bioeconomy Foundation, who's doing fantastic work. And Filippo will talk to us through how to strategically match a company growth and EU funding opportunities. Tom Nolan from Way to Life will share the Way to Life journey on how they've raised funds. Tom has a lot of domain expertise from a finance aspect. Dr. Geraldine Brennan, IMR, Circular, will talk us through the Irish funding mechanisms on the platform. And finally, Dermot Hanley will talk to us on investment in building scalable brands, a lot of global experience. So just some housekeeping, this is being recorded, but please feel free to ask any questions in our Q&A tab. So thank you all for your questions and comments from last week. We had some really great insights from Clodagh from Nutramara, Teresa from Green Generation, and Deirdre from the Dingle Hub, talking about regionality. So thanks to Dublin City Council, Eastern Midlands Waste Region Office for sponsoring this event. And over to you, Joanne, to say a quick hello. Joanne needs to, super. Okay, so we can come back to Joanne. Looks like Joanne might be.
I am so sorry, I didn't unmute.
It's okay, Joanne.
So everyone is very, very welcome, and it's lovely to join you again for our Modus Pathways to the Circular Economy webinar series. So we're on our 3rd webinar today. We're halfway through. Can you believe it? I work, of course, for the Eastern Midlands Regional Waste Management Plan Office, and on behalf of my office, I would just want to say that we are delighted to commission and fund this webinar series. The series is, of course, designed to complement the Modus Circular Economy Training Program for SMEs. And my partner in crime, Michaela Ferrando from the Economic Development Office in Dublin City Council, is here today, and we will moderate your comments and your questions. So please send them to us on the question and answers. And I'm just going to hand you back now to Mary, and she can introduce you to our fabulous panelists for today.
Thank you, Joanne. So to get started, we'll start with Filippo Giancarlo Martinelli, who's the European ambassador for the Irish Bioeconomy Foundation, who's doing fantastic work in growing and developing the Irish bioeconomy in Ireland. So as ambassador, Filippo, it includes support, fundraising, and promotion of the Irish bioeconomy ecosystem within Europe. And Filippo is going to talk about the European support. So welcome, Filippo.
Thank you, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here for myself and for IBF. Thanks a lot for the sponsor for organizing. Indeed, as representing IBF today, I will try to take you by hand on our approach to how to strategically match funding opportunities and company and project growth. So before we dive into the topics, of course, some little introduction of IBF for those of you who do not know us. Our motto and ethos is to grow together the Irish bioeconomy and Ireland bioeconomy as a whole. We are a non-for-profit organization. We are part funded by Enterprise Ireland, the Irish government, Intertrade Ireland, bio-based industries, as well as our members. Our mission is to promote the conversion of the natural resources of Ireland, and we do so in many ways. Currently, our membership, it's around 24, 25 members. You can see it's quite a variety of parties from large to small, public and private. Just to pick a few names, we have, we can count as members as Narintech, who is also a speaker, BHSL, Exafly, Premium Green Energy, and many other SMEs such as Kelada. The way we approach and we support our members and the broader ecosystem is shown in the next slide as a set of pre-competitive support services with design and upcoming scale up, with access to finance, promotion and outreach. And it is within that context that we are part of the Empower Bio project that allow us to spend time in supporting the parties playing and acting and discovering within the bioeconomy field. Now, what is the bioeconomy? It's pretty simple. When you look at this lovely picture from the Helen MacArthur Foundation, you have the linear economy, extraction, use, landfill, and that has allowed for industrial revolution and everything we have today. If you take it back to circular, reuse, reduce, recycle, that's the circular economy. The half of it, the bioeconomy is half of it, the one that deals with biomass, renewables and sustainable resources. So that's what we focus on. Back to our Empower Bio project. It's a European Union BBI specifically funded project that enables us to support SMEs and clusters, helping them to bridge the financial value of debt, approaching them and connecting them with investors, as well as when possible and needed with public funding. And this is the topic of today's conversation. Now, if we look at the overall ecosystem for funding, a lot is happening. It's very complex. And furthermore, it's changing because right now we are in the process of moving from the previous framework program to the current. So we are essentially leaving Horizon 2020 and we're moving into Horizon Europe, for example, among many. So Horizon Europe will be the main funding program in Europe. It's around 100 billion euros. So it's possibly the biggest on the planet. It will pretty much follow Horizon 2020 rules, and it will encompass many funding sources, many goals, many opportunities, including sustainability, including health, including resources. This will be the one you will be hearing the most. So continuously, every 3 months or so, you will have specific opportunities there. This is managed by the European Commission Research Directorate. Parallel to that, and much less known, in fact, it's another program which is not 100 billion, but 3-4 billion normally, yet to be fully confirmed, and the rules are still to be defined, but it has been there and we expect it will still be there for long. It's the LIFE program. It's from DG Environment, so the Environment Department of the Commission. And although big part of the funding are for nature conservation, included in Nature 2000, the network of parks around Europe, there are some hidden gems for process innovation, resource efficiency, and bioprocesses, recycling, and actual industrial innovation, which is a very sweet spot. And in fact, one of the speakers of today is a beneficiary of this funding, and they will tell you more about it. Another program, it's here illustrated, is the so-called EU Innovation Fund, which is a bit of an ambiguous name because it's very generic. Innovation Fund. In fact, it's a very specific fund. It's by DG Energy to complement the DG Environment and the DG Research. And it's mostly focused on innovation and demonstration projects and scale-up projects which impact reduction of greenhouse gases. So it's all about reduction of emissions, and it takes most of its funds from the carbon trading. In fact, this program was essentially frozen for a few years. It used to be called NER 300 5 years or so ago, and now it comes back to life with the name of Innovation Fund. And now ongoing calls are there with a deadline in March, and it's going to be interesting to see how it works out. Finally, and maybe somehow linking to one of the speakers, that is Darmond, on the finance. Although in my speech is mostly focused on public funding, there is an important public action, not on grants, but on finance, equity and debt, that is by the European Investment Bank. They produced a fund, the European Circular Bioeconomy Fund, which is separately managed, and they raised initial 100 millions. They added 250 millions. What they do is equity and debt investment in SMEs, startups, and scale-ups within the bioeconomy. And they been into Ireland. We had the pleasure to co-invite and co-host them, and they are always looking for opportunities to sponsor SMEs, and they will follow banking criteria, but with a strong mandate towards circular and especially bioeconomy. Finally, I've been told that there's some frequently asked questions on what is the European Green Deal and what is the just transition mechanisms. In fact, these are slightly complicated, require slightly complicated answers, in fact, multiple answers. But what I can say very briefly, it's reported in the slide. The European Green is a set of policies and it aims at carbon neutrality. And the just transition mechanism is part, it's aligned with the cohesion policy framework, and it manifests itself with a number of mechanisms that are listed in 1, 2, and 3. Now, what is important to say that although European Green Deal can have manifestations in specific coal topics, so the EIC Green Deal or the Green Deal calls of 2 weeks ago, the European Green Deal is much, much bigger than that. It's a big strategic policy and it embeds in multiple applications, while the just transition mechanism, in fact, it's a big thing, 100 billion itself, but it all goes through regions and countries, territorial plans. So it's not something that you can, as an SME, apply for today, tomorrow. It's something that sets the basis, the foundations, and the resources for those specific opportunities that you can access. So it's not straightforward targets. The straightforward targets are the grant opportunity that pop up here and there, of which I made the selection for you and are presented in slide. And to conclude in the next slide, a way to navigate into this, it's not easy. Some funding programs are better than others. Some funding programs are more advertised than others. The two things, they don't go together. Normally, I would say the more advertised and known it is, probably the least chance you have to win. So you may want to look for the opposite. There is some key questions that we dare to place there to help you to navigate this. One is, when is the deadline? If the deadline is in less than 3 months, it's going to be very tough that you can apply for that. What is the funding body? We said DG Research, Environment, Energy, very, very different. Whatever the funding body, the different policies. So your technology and products, does it fit into that? It's all to be defined. Now, does it require a big consortium? Can you go alone? How close do you have to be to the market? That's a critical one. And very important, what is the actual funding rate? The way funding rates are calculated, it determines how much money you have to spend to get how much money in grant. And they're calculated in very different ways. You can go from 50 to even imagine 150, depending on how you count it. So it's very important to understand that. But please note, the higher the funding rate, the more the competition and the more projects that don't have a strong business case will be there. So you will need to compete with more people. While the lower the funding rate, the less interesting for less business-oriented stakeholders. So the higher success chance you would normally have. Okay. So finally, last question will be, how much time is this going to take you? And you really have to budget for that. How much time, how much concentration, how much focus from your workforce? Can you afford to spend that time, or can your team afford it? Or would you rather check out for somebody else to do it? There are consultants that do the job quite well, but from our side as a cluster, we are in a good position to be able to provide some indications to SMEs and startups to who to approach or what to do, what not to do before interfacing with the consulting or before diving into it by yourself. And we are happy, thanks to our founders, to spend some of our time to help SMEs and startups in the bioeconomy to understand if this is what they want or not. So we are available and reachable at our contact. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Filippo, for taking us through the funding that's available across Europe. So it feels like there's lots of money, but getting access to it is maybe challenging or time consuming. How can companies access this funding more efficiently?
Yes, thanks, Kira. It's all about being strategic and looking at what you have, what assets, inventions, what you will be doing, what investments, what products you will be launching, and then challenging that against the offer for grants, which changes in time. There are generalistic grants that are open all the time that anybody can apply. These are typically the most difficult ones to get because everybody applies. Or there are opportunistic grants that will come with a very, very specific subject at one moment. And are you there at the right moment? That's one. Monitor what's there. Be a bit critical about what you go for. Get ready for spending a lot of time. And finally, maybe understand if you are a very good match for that opportunity, or if that opportunity is better match for other players who have already done a lot of activities there. Finally, you don't necessarily, or SMEs often tend to want to go alone, to lead, to go for bids that are very suitable for them. Often happens that rather than leading your own bid, you would better start by joining a bigger bid as a smaller partner, so you understand how the ecosystem works. You spend less time on it, and meanwhile, you're building your network. So don't always think about going for the big money by yourself. Rather consider getting smaller pieces of bigger pies or bigger networks so that you understand how the game works and you're better equipped later on. So that's that would be an advice, and we are happy to chat and discuss with specific technology owners or problem owners on this.
Super, Filippo, and your contact details are within the presentation. That'll be circulated afterwards for people who want to contact you directly. I'd like to now invite another speaker, Tom Nolan. Tom is a director of Naring Tech. And Tom is going to take us through one of those funding mechanisms which Way to Life has accessed. And Tom, by background, brings a wealth of experience across corporate finance. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Kira, for the introduction there. As Kira mentioned, I'm going to bring you through the Way to Life project that we're working on at the moment. And by way of background and context to it, if we can move on to the next slide. The project participants include ourselves, our sister company, and our parent company. And our parent company and our sister company in particular have been deeply involved in the green economy since the early 2000s, primarily by way of development of renewable energy projects, but also in waste management, including within our sister company, a composting facility and the utilization of organic waste to produce renewable energy by way of anaerobic digestion. The waste management business has always had a philosophy of focusing on the streams that it has been developing in order to extract as much value as possible from the materials being processed by it. And you can see in the pictures on the right-hand side of the slide there, sort of photographs of the various facilities that we have in operation in Ireland at this point in time. Next slide, please. In terms of Way to Life, our sister company, Ormond Organics, had finished the development of an anaerobic digestion facility in a site that had previously acquired in 2019. And on that site was significant but underutilized infrastructure. And we set about finding a useful use for that infrastructure in a manner which aligned with the business that was being undertaken by Ormond Organics. And we identified a possible opportunity to take a byproduct from cheese and whey processing and using it as a substrate on which we could produce a non-GMO yeast protein for use in animal and fish feeds. And how we started out was effectively investing to validate that concept at a very small scale level and to try and establish what the potential for that market would be going forward. And you can see there on the right-hand side, the effectively the resource efficiency that we're trying to bring about by taking a linear value chain and then converting that into a circular value chain where we can put the whey permeate through a biorefinery process. That biorefinery process produces an animal feed, but at the same time, the wastes coming out of that biorefinery process can be used in our anaerobic digestion facility. And indeed, the surplus energy that's been produced within our anaerobic digestion facility can be used within the biorefinery itself. So we established that there was both an opportunity to valorize the whey permeate, which was this undervalued byproduct, and equally that there were synergies with the existing infrastructure that we had on site already. Next slide, please. So in terms of the funding landscape, I think it's fair to say that funding of projects such as ours is a very difficult thing to do. We're looking at a new business line, we're looking at a new process, and we're looking at new products. And each of those elements carry very significant risks. So notwithstanding the significant opportunity that's there, that was something that we had to consider very, very carefully. We were also cognizant that we would be putting in place a lot of physical infrastructure. Even though we were already invested in an underutilized infrastructure, we had to invest significant more amounts of money to put that in place, and it would take time and investment in order to achieve that. So we were of the view that, you know, for projects such as ours, that there are a range of different funding instruments that will be needed going forward in order to realize projects like this. For our own part, we looked across the various types of funding that would typically be available, from angel investors to seed funds, to venture funds, to the enterprise or the old BES schemes. But prior experience led us to conclude that none of those, or we were not going to be a fit with any of those. And that's primarily because of the quantum of investment that we require, because what we're looking to invest is in the numbers of millions. The risk profile associated with the project, because we have a number of binary outcomes as we go through our development, and the timelines that are required by these funds in terms of obtaining a return on their investment. Equally, we looked at debt. It's simply not available to us at this stage in our development. And indeed, we know from our other activities that getting debt finance and support for some of the projects is very difficult in an Irish context. We, of course, did interact with Enterprise Ireland, and we've used the innovation vouchers system that they have in place and found that to be very good. And indeed, we've utilized an innovation partnership support in conjunction with DCU. They also have, for earlier stage companies, a very effective instrument, which is the high performance startups. But as the amount that they can invest there is capped at 500,000, it's very small relative to the investment requirements that are needed to put in place physical infrastructure. Partnerships, we think, are a very important route, and that is one that we continue to pursue. But one of the areas we did look at in particular was the EU funding programs, given the nature of the activities we're proposing to undertake. And just to take you through the next slide, if I may. We're entirely new to EU funding and EU funding programs, but we wanted to try and understand if there was a fit with what we were trying to accomplish. And so what we did is we went out, we did a desktop review ourselves, and then we brought on board an experienced consultant to work with us. And as it turns out, that experienced consultant was Felipe, who spoke earlier in this webinar. So through him and working with him, we identified the resource efficiency stream of the EU LIFE program as a possible match. What we liked about that program was it was a two-stage application program. The first stage was a light submission. And once you got through that light submission, you knew that there was a significant prospect of you getting through the second submission if you put the time, energy, and effort into it. So we made the first submission in September 18. We were successful in that regard. We worked really hard then on putting the second stage, very detailed submission together. And we were happy to get that on board and get that through the system. And in that, I think it's worth mentioning, we were supported by the Department of Ag, the Department of Environment, and a number of the dairy Irish dairy processors, such as Dairy Gold. And we're very thankful for the weight that they lent to the submission and believe it had an influence in getting our grant approved. We've got a grant agreement, we put it in place, and we commenced our project immediately thereafter. The funding coming from this grant agreement is very important to us in that it complements the significant investment being made by our shareholders in this project. Next slide, please. In terms of the challenges and the responses that we have come across during this process, the first key one for us was validating the business case. And I think that should be fair for every small and medium enterprise or every enterprise that's looking at this space, in particular because it is very capital intensive and there are very significant risks put in place. So one of the things we had to consider is how much capital would we put at risk at any point in time in order to progress the project, knowing that the outcome associated with it might be binary. We have significant challenges around scaling the process. We were concerned that while it was possible to get it to work in a laboratory environment, could we get it to work at commercial scale and industrial setting? It is very different, we have found out. The other area that we needed to be satisfied around was the availability of the substrate itself. We'd be aware, for example, from our other business, that whilst there are numerous reports out there which say that the substrate should be available or materials should be available, that's not always the case in practice. And some of that comes down to contamination issues. And for example, brown bins in Ireland, we know that there is a huge tonnage available in Ireland that's well recorded, but the usable fraction of that in terms of the development of biogas is much, much smaller than would be thought. The other challenges we had were around product. How do we validate our product in advance of actually putting in place the physical infrastructure, and working around that and the risks associated with that. Timelines are also very important. They are long and they are uncertain, in particular in the current environment. So the responses were very much around taking a stage and gate approach to managing our risk, in that we would agree a resource that we put to work. We wanted to accomplish an objective out of that. We leveraged the existing capabilities of our partner companies and the infrastructure that were there. It is fair to say that the EU support for the EU LIFE programme was decisive. Without that, I don't think this project would have proceeded. Very much open to taking a risk rewarding approach in terms of sharing the risk and sharing the rewards, and we have done that with both Enterprise Ireland and DCC. We had to build our own pilot facility for scaling, and really important to us on that was the ownership and the ability to control it. And we believe that that was essential for the success that we have achieved so far, and hopefully will continue into the future. Because what it did was it gave us access to the facility at all times, and it also allowed us to make alterations to the facility, whereas we wouldn't be able to achieve that if we were using commercially rented facilities or third-party facilities. To de-risk the product side, we undertook feed trials, developed sample products, and so we've managed to get very comfortable around that. But we continue to be very open to stakeholder engagement and partnership formations in order to continue to develop and de-risk the business. So hopefully that's given you an overview of the Way to Life project, where we come to, and hopefully where we're going to.
Fantastic, Tom. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. It's great to hear from a successful candidate who's been through the program, and it'll give others listening here today maybe some ideas around getting access to that type of financing. Just one question that, and I think you've touched on it, around de-risking throughout the project, but what would you say helped de-risk the Way to Life project?
I think there were a couple of things there from our perspective. One, we were working with very experienced stakeholders who had an appetite for the type of risk we were taking on board. The second thing is, it is a new business area for us, but it's an adjunct to the existing business area of getting value from organic materials. The third thing for us would be very much around the existing infrastructure that we had in place. To put that infrastructure in place today would cost a number of millions. So we head start like that, which won't necessarily be available to other projects or other endeavours. And then finally, the support of the EU LIFE programme, which came in and effectively risk shared alongside ourselves. So those were the important things for ourselves in de-risking the project.
Thank you very much. Mary, would you like to?
Super, great. Thank you, Ciara. That was really interesting. Overview from Tom, excellent, and Filippo, thank you for that. So next up we have Dr. Geraldine Brennan. So Geraldine is a leading expert in the circular economy, and she has spent the last decade exploring the barriers and enablers of the implementation of the circular and sustainable business models. So Geraldine is the lead program manager with the Irish Manufacturing Research, delivering their flagship circular economy initiative, Circulaire. So Geraldine.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's great to be here. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to do a very high-level recap of some of the key sectors of opportunity, building on what Filippo has highlighted and Tom. Ultimately, Ireland, given its agri-food sector, which is attributable to 32% of GHGs, is a significant opportunity when it comes to valorization and different circular strategies. Another area that's really important is pharmaceuticals. Ireland is home to about 90 pharmaceutical manufacturing sites around the country. Those areas that I highlight there are all areas of significance highlighted by the European Union in their Circular Economy Action Plan. And the other point to make is just that back, coming up over a decade ago, some scenarios estimated that just a 5% material improvement could yield over €2 billion opportunity when it comes to implementing the circular economy. So there's a huge opportunity out there, and it's just really about how SMEs and larger businesses alike can tap into that. Next slide, please. So who is Circulaire? We're the national platform for circular manufacturing. We're cross-sectoral. As you can see, we have actors from the food and drinks, agri-food sector, built environment, packaging, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and then what we refer to as second life enablers. We our Irish Manufacturing Research is the Secretariat, and it's funded by the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications, the EPA and Climate Kick. Next slide, please. In terms of how Circulaire, as one of Ireland's first circular economy innovation networks, funds industry, one of the key ways is through an internal ring-fenced innovation fund. And effectively, it's not a huge fund, but nonetheless, it is dedicated to our network. It's €1.5 million over the 3-year duration of the program. And it's about supporting industry to lead demonstrations around circularity to ultimately de-risk further investment for scale up. So it's about prototyping and piloting. What Tom referred to is how do you prove the concept of what you're seeking to ultimately scale? And that's often very, very much where there's the high initial, when things are new, getting funds to do that is challenging. And it's challenging, particularly for industry in COVID, never mind before. Another key area that Circulaire funds is new ventures. We've just last year opened a call for startups, and that is our first cohort. As you can see, there's actors from agri-food, and also an organization that's looking at footwear manufacturing, bring that to Ireland, and then technology to enable reverse logistics, which is a key enabler of circularity. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the funding for circular innovation, to build on what Filippo has highlighted and Tom has brought to life, I just wanted to flag some of the key national and additional European areas where SMEs can go for funding and different types of funding. On your left-hand side, you heard Tom refer to Enterprise Ireland. In addition to things like the innovation partnerships, which fund up to about 200K, you have other offers for businesses who are trying to explore circularity, where effectively the Lean and the Green Start programs are about offering you advisory and small amounts of money to explore ways to improve your production processes. When it comes to things like the Green Enterprise Fund from the Environmental Protection Agency, we have an example in IMR where we're working with Penelto Foods and a microbrewery to test the opportunities for industrial symbiosis. And this was funding we got through the EPA, which tends to fund projects. Sorry, I'm not, if we go back to the funding landscape slide, please. Something's happened with the clicker. Thank you. That is an example of, again, where you have industry coming together to do a proof of concept, and you're looking at roughly about 100K for that kind of an innovation demonstrator. Then you also have bigger ticket national funds, like, for example, the Disruptive Technologies Innovation Fund, which looks for a minimum of applicants seeking €1.5 million. These are much bigger consortiums tending towards very significant disruptive technologies that will change the nature of things, and again looking to climate and circular economy as key areas where disruptive innovation can make a mark. Then you also have things, and Tom, I'm delighted you spoke about it because I realized I left it off my list of Enterprise Ireland, is the high performance startup grants is another key area to support startups. But you also have the Halo Business Angel Network, and again this is seed investment for startups in this space. On the right-hand side, shifting to some additional organizations and sources to fund, you have things like C-Voucher and DigiCirc, which are European-funded programs that are offering essentially advisory services as well as up to 60K equity-free grants to SMEs who are seeking to shift from a linear to a circular business model. And then you have bespoke capital companies, or sorry, investment companies that are emerging, like Circularity Capital, which actually is a spin out from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which looks to fund between 2 and 6 million euro to SMEs who are seeking equity in that region. Next slide, please. And last but not least, this is just, I guess, a bit of a provocation and I suppose a signal and a signpost. Effectively, in the last couple of years, over there, we've seen 5 different bespoke circular economy funds. And really, I put this up merely to say that this is a strong signal from mainstream investment that circular economy is something that is becoming better understood. And just like sustainable finance and that whole movement, we're hoping that this trend will continue and you'll ultimately see dedicated credit facilities, the likes of Intesa Sanpaolo in Italy, emerging around Europe. Thank you very much.
Super, Geraldine, that was really insightful. Thank you very much. Really good. So maybe just one question. So you've talked there about all the different types of funding. So people listening are thinking, where do you start? So if you have a company that's 200K or you have a company that's 200 or 2 million, where do they start?
So again, I think, Tom describing his role and his journey with Way to Life is a really good example of, you can look to things like Enterprise Ireland, where you can get 10K to do a feasibility study, to just to understand the tip of the iceberg of what you're potentially seeking to explore, going up through to an innovation partnership for 200K. When it comes to the likes of the millions, you're going to be looking to, like Filippo said, Horizon Europe if you're looking for grant funding, or the likes of bespoke equity investors like Circularity Capital, and again, they're a niche player in the mainstream finance space, but ultimately you are constrained when it comes to capex investments to the likes of the bigger funds. So there's actually quite a bit available for Irish SMEs with regards to Enterprise Ireland, Green Enterprise Fund, innovation vouchers, the smaller pieces of money from, like I said, 10K to 100 to maybe 200K. There are opportunities out there when it comes to looking to fund circular economy proof of concepts, and then again, Circular, our own funds projects up to a max of about 250K.
For sure, super. And I guess the larger funds then, like Filippo talked about, the European Circular Bioeconomy, will scale those for scaling companies. Okay, thank you, Geraldine, that's super. Okay, to our next speaker, Dermot Handley. So Dermot is an experienced independent non-executive director and an experienced investment banker. He's previously founded an award-winning yogurt company called Muesli. And in Roundtable Partners, Dermot's exploring the opportunity of a consolidated service platform with targeted equity investment for the circular and bioeconomies. Dermot, over to you.
Thanks, Murray, and thanks to all the speakers. I think it's just reflecting that when we talk about the bioeconomy, and particularly my area of interest and focus would be the food and food ingredient space. If you kind of go to the next slide, you'll see it's all entirely obvious. Everyone knows that we need to find a new way of doing things. Everyone knows we need to feed the planet, and that we need to absolutely improve the quality of the food that consumers eat, and that seems to be reflected in terms of what people want, be it the dreaded millennials or in terms of the trends that we're seeing, people realizing that you actually are what you eat. So it's all obvious, everyone knows the opportunity is there. So why is it so difficult, and why isn't the industry responding? And we have a relatively short time today, so what I won't do is go through all the problems, but maybe just talk a little bit about some of whom the obvious providers of this solution to the bioeconomy are, what needs to be done, and what's not happening there. Because I think in terms of the reason they aren't acting is in many ways the opportunity that smaller companies have to fill that need and ultimately create value for themselves, and then really fundamentally in the end, value for consumers. Because I think companies have to aspire to be actually relevant. So by relevant, I mean that if they weren't there tomorrow, their customers, be it on the industrial side or be it on the ultimate, retail consumer side, would miss them. So, the obvious person or company that should be responding to the requirement for improved food quality and circularity should be the large, fast-moving consumer goods companies. And why aren't they doing it? They're trying, certainly they are, but they're kind of getting held back by things like consumer credibility. So they've got quite a bad reputation over the last 30 to 40 years with a real focus on food engineering and price pressure. And ultimately, I think people are starting to push back. And we've seen multiple announcements of people with well-known brands saying that they've had to do either a reformulation or, in fact, you shouldn't eat their products more than a couple of times a week because it would ultimately be bad for you, part of a controlled diet. That's a remarkable statement that some companies do. And really also it's a function of they are what they are. So, they get judged by their investors, which again is going to drive behavior of their CEO and their management teams as to their ability to do and to defend space within the shelves and to achieve a above organic growth or above market growth level of market share for them. And they have restrictions. They are geared up for that. They don't have the flexibility to have the conversations with retailers. We'll talk about in a minute about swapping things out. You could take a very well-known brand that's defending its space, and then when you go in and you try and get more of your square inch on the square centimeter on the shelf or the planogram, that's a more difficult conversation to have with the buyer. And fundamentally, they are geared to do what they do, which is almost like mass carpet bombing in effect in terms of actually growing their business. The other big constituency here I think people should pay attention to is what the multiples of the large stores are doing. And I think what's very interesting there is that there is a huge opportunity there for people to get in there. And I think it's a function of the realization that the more progressive stores are coming up to is that they realize that historically because they've been pushing price, in effect, what's happening is their percentage margins have been maintained, but their cash margins are getting reduced. And in the end, in the era of the internet and the attack from some of the very efficient European discount stores, all these stores are really an owner of property. So if you're moving goods through it, you want it to be of higher value. Higher value by definition is going to be newer, more premium, and with a brand, basically. So that is the opportunity. If you come up with something that fills in with the service requirements, I think you will get a ready year, and you can kind of see that reflected in some of the behaviors of certainly Irish stores, and that's even happening internationally as well. So if you kind of go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about, what's been kind of going on. And it's really sort of the main things people should be focused on, kind of what I would view as being the four main foundations that are fundamental to success. And it's things like validating what your market access is, what the customer need is, be that either going in as an ingredient supplier to larger manufacturers or indeed going into the consumer, what they want. That's a very important piece. People should be really focused on that. Things such as management skills, I think that's a given. People have to have the vision and the entrepreneurial wherewithal and indeed the depth of the team to actually grow their business. And then particularly important, which people I think miss, is the ability to produce consistently and at low cost. It's a little bit apple pie and motherhood, but it's fundamentally important. There's one thing that a larger company or a retailer cannot take, and that is a failure on either consistency or indeed a failure of delivery. And this is a cost-based business. If you do not hit the cost, you will not be in business for much longer. And that's a fundamental problem that people have in terms of growing their business that they need to address. And if I was going to give advice on that, which I will in a moment, it's they should focus on a particular niche and make sure they're doing that properly. So it's not easy. It's not easy getting capital either. You need to grow, and we've talked a little bit about that at the top, and I'll talk a little bit more about how people should think about going into access that capital in a moment. So on the next slide, it's a fantastic environment. If you just go to the next slide, fantastic environment because there's a lot of action kind of going on, and the writing's a bit small here, but some of these brands people on the call may actually know and may not realize that some of these companies have been selling for massive multiples. Be it Epic that was selling at 5 times revenue, or Naked Foods and sort of 40.5 times cash flow. Let me tell you, as a former investment banker, they are serious, almost unheard of valuation multiples that entrepreneurs and companies have been able to achieve. So there's a huge amount of money available, either from strategic players or indeed from private equity players who are kind of keen to play. So just to reiterate on the next slide, the things that you need to be focused on in terms of success, it's got to be a scalable, high ambition business. There's no point, saying we're going to be just within Ireland. You will not attract the capital. It will not be worth your while. It's just too small a market. I mean, for a branded, high-end food product, I mean, the market in Ireland is probably around 600,000 people, I would say. That's not going to, basically justify the amount of effort and capital that you need to require. It's got to be on trend. It's got to be differentiated, and it's got to be reasonably high margin and defensible against competition. And that's what you need to focus on. You need to have ambition. And one thing, just realize, Geraldine and the team had talked a little bit about accessing institutional capital. It's a very important thing with that you should realize, is that every professional provider of capital is on what they would call the kind of the 2 and 20 model. And what that actually means is that there's a minimum hurdle rate that if they don't do higher than that, and that's usually a number about 8 to 10%, they will not get paid. So they have no interest in companies that are just about getting through or just about succeeding. They've got to hit the ball out of the park. So when you're going for capital, be ambitious, have a good story. And if there's capital available, which there is these days, I mean, we've just talked about that, take it. Now is a very good time to do capital, and you will always be able to deploy it. So good luck, everybody.
Thank you, Dermot. That was really insightful. And Sinead, you might leave that slide up for a few minutes. So Dermot, maybe one question. There was a lot there, just even to unpack that and the opportunities and the challenges coming in from an investment banking aspect. Yes. So you've worked in Canada, and what do you see is the main difference between Irish European investors, because for our scaling companies, versus say what's been happening in North America and Canada?
Right. I think there's more money over in North America, and particularly in this space. A lot of the early investment that came in was really funded from top tier tech type entrepreneurs or VC funds who had done so well on the whole digital transformation. We're also seeing their lifestyle. A lot of these trends have actually been driven from, call it the West Coast of America, not being reflected in the foods and the items that they wish to buy. So that's really why they got involved. And it's almost been success breeding success. So there's a very definite model in terms of how to attract capital. There's more of it there. And I think more important, I think their success has been much stronger. There is an effect in North America where it's much easier to grow if it's right. It's kind of the Whole Foods effect. If you get one listing with Whole Foods, you're in business. The volumes are there that enable to get traction. It's easier to handle. You're focused on a deeper demographic in terms of the companies the customers that you wish to attract. And then once you get momentum, that grows. That's much more difficult in Europe. We have much more differentiated markets, more fractured distribution networks, and it's more difficult. But so I think if I was thinking about even in a European context, there's a huge opportunity. No one knows branding and premium goods better than Europeans do. That's the opportunity. And what I would really advise people to do is make sure that your same store sales growth is good. I would much prefer to be investing in a company that is getting a higher rate of growth with 100 stores than one that's getting a lower rate of growth with 1,000 stores. You need to have a much better story in terms of how you actually bridge and use your capital to grow. But the opportunity is absolutely there, and no one has been better than building brands than Europeans. And I think that's the opportunity for us in the whole renewable and environmental space.
Super. That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Dermot. Okay, so there's a number of fantastic pitches there from everybody, from our presenters. So there's a number of questions coming in, but we might just move back to Filippo just for a moment, if you could put your mic on, Filippo. Your last slide that you had up was excellent, actually, in and around the companies considering participation, which are 7 steps. If I'm an SME and I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, I'd like to take part in Horizon Europe, where do they find that lead partner or that collaboration from an SME aspect, or even indeed vice versa? Even when Tom talked a lot about collaborating and networking and partnerships. But where do they find them, Filippo?
Yeah. So you obviously can have your own network, your suppliers and your clients and your research partner. That's always a good way to go. If you are having any academic collaborations, scientists by nature would tend to be more networked internationally. So you can always have a chat with your researcher of trust, which has a strong interest in going for funding. Alternatively or complementarily, do not hesitate to speak with your local cluster, and clusters exist in every place and market. They just may have different names. Irish Bioeconomy Foundation is an innovation cluster and national association, so it's obvious, but there's also countries where there are regional clusters, or there are countries where the local chamber of commerce act as a cluster. There are places where there are incubators, and incubators are clusters. So go where innovation happens, and they would typically have some open innovation officer or staff or people that can then start pointing you in the right direction. Then sooner or later you will realize what target you want to go for, and then it will come to the decision: do I do it alone? Do I do it with a partner? Do I go for professionals and all that? But a good starting path is to go for either a researcher or a cluster, and to have a chat with them. Yeah.
Yes, and your point, and Tom's point earlier as well, is not to go alone. You know, really, if you want to scale and grow that. And I see you've answered one of the questions because people won't have access to them. Here in the chat, a question from William was, when planning to submit a project to these funds, how could applicants show that the project will affect the competitiveness of companies in a positive way? Now, I know it's specific, but that's interesting, that competitive question. And Filippo, what do you, just on that question?
So on the first question or the second question from?
On the first question, yeah.
Okay, so well, sorry, because in the chat I can see two questions, so I may have lost
no
a
problem.
bit. Sorry for that.
Yeah, that's okay, Filippo.
Mary, can I jump in with a
question? You can, of course, yeah, absolutely.
For Tom, if that's okay. Tom, it was around the participation in the European fund. Getting access to financing was one, I suppose, aspect of it. Were there benefits to being involved with other European companies in the same boat? Were there learnings, I suppose, transferred through being part of that program?
The answer is yes, because they look at things very differently, and different companies evaluate things in a different manner. So, you know, you can take on board how they approach things. You can learn from their previous experiences. They oftentimes operate in different sectors to yourselves. We have a Belgian partner on board. You know, it gives you an international perspective on things rather than a purely Irish perspective on things. So I think it is beneficial from that perspective. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
Super great. Thank you, Kieran. And I guess, Filippo, just to maybe finish off on that previous question, yes, where William was asking planning to submit. I think your answer was, you know, you said it there, it's very specific to the grant opportunity, yes, is what you summarized. So it's really looking at each one from a competitive aspect. So that's, yes, great.
And so, the funding source as well. So who is the promoter, what segment, what public body is promoting what? And depending on that, it all changes, because the impact is always measured as a function of the investor or the funding body. So what does your bank or your public grant provider, what do they look for? And they look for different things, or they look for the same thing with different weights. Everybody looks for, yes, return, yes, and sustainability with different weights. So you have to decline that depending on the source of the funding.
And that's interesting, because I think William was referring to as well, as he noted. So thank you for answering that, Filippo. He was focused on digital technologies and the circular economy. And indeed, Kieran and myself have done quite a bit on the digital technology end. So that's an interesting angle. Geraldine, maybe just a question for you. It was a question on the Q&A. So if you don't qualify for EI funding as not exporting, but looking for funding to commercialize proven technologies, where is the best place to look? And Actually, Geraldine, you made a really insightful comment, I thought, during the week in one of our discussions, saying that, you know, people need to keep an eye on the full landscape, because sometimes European pockets of money comes up, or calls that people can look at, sometimes in around it can be in proven technologies or not. Maybe Geraldine, your response to that one, on that question.
So I think it's a very fair question. A lot of, obviously, Enterprise Ireland's focus of their offerings are for companies that are exporting. You know, one area, and again, it depends on the size of the business, the local enterprise offices, which are part of Enterprise Ireland, focus on smaller businesses and say you need to demonstrate the potential to export, but you don't have to be exporting. So that could be an angle. Again, building on what Dermot said about, you know, when you're looking for investment, if you're only looking at Ireland, that tends to mean you preclude yourself because of the size of the Irish markets. So I guess it's something to be aware of, that focusing on other markets that you can grow into is not necessarily a bad thing, even if you can't go there yet. It's about thinking about starting and piloting in Ireland and where you go from there. With regards to the European opportunities, as Filippo said, you know, sometimes grants come through different types of European programs called CSAs, which are effectively mechanisms for distributing grant funding and replicating activity. So, for example, separately to the circular and sustainable manufacturing, IMR, Irish Manufacturing Research, has been part of a innovation network around robotics and digitization, and that has been about disseminating funding to help manufacturers, SMEs, essentially improve their operations and deploy these technologies. So it effectively has been a grant funder through the European Union. So there's almost like these regional calls. So we were, you know, the Irish hub for this dissemination of these grants, separate to the bigger calls, which are just about coming into consortium and competing against other consortia. So I think I really echo what Filippo did and others around finding ways to find information about where the opportunities are in the system, so that you're always on the lookout for that specific example that fits right for you as you go on this journey.
Super, that's great, Geraldine. And maybe just one final question for Dermot before we finish up. Geraldine talked about earlier in her slides, and certainly you've talked about it too, Dermot, is, you know, the market for finance is changing and the funding landscape. Where would you say, if you were to say the top 2 or 3, the greatest changes, Dermot, where would you say they are? Key changes?
I think people's expectations are higher, and I think there's more capital available. So there has been an absolute sea change in terms of investor appetite for risk assets over the last number of months, and indeed longer than that. And I think with a lot of the quantitative easing that's been going on from central banks, that is probably not going to go away in the short to medium term. So there's a fantastic opportunity if companies have the right story and they can get out and present their proposition correctly. I think there's a huge opportunity. And then fundamentally, there's a huge need here, right? So there's a huge need for the economy, there's a huge need for consumers, and there's a huge need for industrial companies. So now's the time.
Super, that's excellent, that's super. Okay, so we're going to close. Thank you very much to all our attendees for joining. We're delighted to have you today. So hope you found this of benefit. We've included our resource link, the links that the presenters have talked about, but we only had an hour and we could only cover so much on some of the mechanisms that are available. If you'd like to check out, Tom has referred to and Geraldine has referred to angel investment, HBAN are running a All-Ireland conference on February the 11th. We put the link up on our resources. And also, we didn't talk much about impact in investing and the growth of that as well. You can also check that out on HBAN and Phase running a session on that at the conference. So thank you to all our speakers, Filippo, Tom, Geraldine and Dermot. And thank you to Dublin City Council, Joanna and Michaela, and Kira from Planet Matters, and Sinead from Web Journey, our digital marketing partner. Thank you. And next week, we are talking about rethinking plastics, and we look forward to you joining us then. Thank you.
Thank you.